The Galactic Council declared humans weak. Then the war began. The chamber was cold. Not the kind of cold that came from poor heating or a broken vent. It was the kind of cold that was designed, deliberate, calculated, meant to remind you that you did not belong here. I had been sitting in the single human seat for 3 hours before anyone even acknowledged that I had arrived. My name is HFY. I was 41 years old, a commander in the Earth Defense Corps and the sole human representative at the 47th session of the Galactic Council. I had prepared for this day for 6 years. I had studied every species in that chamber, memorized their customs, their languages, their histories. I had rehearsed my arguments until I could say them in my sleep. None of it mattered. The chamber was built to hold thousands of delegates. Curved rows of seats rose in a wide arc around a central floor, and every seat was filled. The Vethkai occupied the highest tier, as they always did. They were tall, gray-skinned, slow-moving creatures who had been traveling the stars for 60,000 years. They did not rush. They did not need to. When you had lived that long, everything around you felt temporary. Everything around you was temporary, including, apparently, human ambitions. The Doreth sat to my left, insect-like beings with 4 arms and compound eyes that caught the light like broken glass. The Sul filled the far right tier, their massive aquatic forms suspended in pressurized tanks built directly into the seating structure. There were 11 other species I could name, and at least 6 I had never seen before. Every single one of them had been in space longer than humanity had been building cities. And then there was me, alone on the floor, in a chair that was slightly too large and set slightly too low, so that I had to look up at all of them. I told myself it was unintentional. I knew it was not. The session was called to order by the council speaker, a Vethkai elder named Counselor Vreth, whose translated voice came through my earpiece as a flat, emotionless sound, like someone reading coordinates aloud. He announced the purpose of the session in exactly 4 sentences. Humanity's 40-year probationary membership was under review. A formal assessment had been conducted. The results would be presented. A vote would follow. I had been told to expect this. What I had not been told was how it would feel to sit there and listen. The Vethkai chief assessor, a being called Oru, rose from the upper tier and moved to the presentation floor. He was nearly 3 meters tall, and he moved with the slow, deliberate grace of something that had never once felt urgency in its entire existence. He placed a data crystal on the podium, and the chamber's display systems activated, projecting columns of information that floated in the air above us all. Oru began to speak. He spoke for 40 minutes. His assessment covered human biology, human psychology, human history, and human decision-making patterns. He cited studies. He cited simulations. He cited 70 years of observed data gathered since first contact. He was thorough. He was precise. And with every sentence, I felt the temperature in my chest drop another degree. The biological section came first. Humans, Oru explained, had an average lifespan of roughly 80 years, which was, by council standards, almost insultingly brief. The Vethkai lived for over 4,000 years. The Doreth lived for 600. Even the Sul, who were considered short-lived by galactic standards, averaged 220 years. A human diplomat, Oru noted, could not even finish a single term of a standard council cycle before dying of old age. Then came psychology. Humans, he said, were emotionally compromised. We made decisions based on feelings rather than pure logic. We grieved. We feared. We loved. We allowed those internal states to influence external actions in ways that were, from a purely rational standpoint, inefficient and unpredictable. He used the word compromised 7 times in that section alone. I counted. Then came the section I had not prepared for. Oru presented what he called the capability assessment. It was a ranking, a formal, documented ranking of every species in the council, measured across 4 categories: intellectual endurance, physical resilience, tactical consistency, and long-term strategic reliability. Humanity ranked last in all 4, not near the bottom, last. He showed us the numbers. He showed us the models. He showed us the projections. According to the Galactic Council's own science, humans were the weakest species in known space. I kept my hands flat on my knees. I kept my face still. I had learned a long time ago that the moment you showed emotion in a room that did not understand emotion, you proved every point they were making about you. Oru concluded his presentation and returned to his seat. There was no applause in the chamber. The council did not applaud. They simply waited in the way that ancient things wait, with no impatience at all. Councillor Vreth asked if the human representative wished to respond before the vote. I stood. I walked to the podium. I was aware of every eye in that chamber, eyes of every shape and color and number, watching me cross the floor. I was the smallest thing in the room. I was probably the shortest-lived thing in the room. I was standing in a building that had existed for longer than my entire civilization. I adjusted the microphone, even though I did not need to. I spoke for 8 minutes. I did not argue with the data. I did not dispute the lifespan numbers or the biological assessments or the psychological findings. I acknowledged all of it. I said, yes, we live briefly. Yes, we feel deeply. Yes, our decisions are sometimes emotional. And then I asked the council a single question. In all of your thousands of years of recorded history, I said, has any species ever accomplished more in less time than we have? Nobody answered. They were not required to. I told them that humanity had gone from wooden sailing ships to interstellar travel in less than 500 years. I told them that we had survived 2 near-extinction events, 3 global conflicts and a climate collapse, and come out the other side building faster and thinking harder each time. I told them that our brevity was not a weakness. It was an engine. Every human alive knew they would die. That knowledge did not paralyze us. It pushed us. Then I said the thing I had not planned to say. It came out quietly, almost to myself. You have just made the single worst decision in the history of this galaxy. The vote was held 40 minutes later. It was unanimous. Humanity was denied full council membership and reclassified as a protected ward species. Our outer colonies would fall under council administration. Our defense installations in those systems would be subject to inspection and limitation. We would retain nominal self-governance over Earth and the inner planets, but everything beyond that was now, legally, under council jurisdiction. I was escorted out of the chamber by 2 Doreth security officers who were each twice my height. As the great doors closed behind me, I heard something that the translation software struggled to interpret. It was the closest thing those ancient species had to laughter. I stood alone in the corridor, in the cold, in the silence. I thought about what came next. I thought about the colonists on Marin's Deep and Caro Station and the 14 other frontier worlds that had just, without being asked, been handed to strangers. I thought about the people who had built those worlds with their hands in the dark, far from Earth, because that was what humans did. We went further. We always went further. I did not feel defeated. I felt something older than that. Something that had no good name in any of the 11 languages I spoke. Something that lived in the part of you that does not reason, does not calculate, does not assess capability or lifespan or strategic reliability. Something that simply remembers. I picked up my bag. I walked to the transport bay. I sent one message to Earth, 2 words long, before the signal was routed through council relay stations where it would certainly be read. The message said, "It's time." Then I went to find my ship. 6 months after the council vote, I was standing in the mud on Marin's Deep, watching a Vethkai administrator explain to a crowd of miners that their morning shift schedules were being restructured for resource efficiency optimization. Nobody said anything. The miners stood in their work gear, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth, faces unreadable. Behind them, the processing towers hummed the way they always did, a low, constant sound that you stopped hearing after your first week on the planet. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy with the kind of clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. I had been reassigned 6 weeks after the council session. My new title was Colonial Liaison, which sounded important until you understood what it actually meant. I was the human face placed between the council administrators and the people they were now responsible for. My job was to explain council decisions to the colonists in terms they would accept, and to explain colonist concerns to the administrators in terms they would consider. I was, in every practical sense, a translator for a conversation that neither side wanted to have. The administrator, whose name translated roughly as Coordinator Cell, was speaking in the flat, measured tones that all Vethkai used for public communication. The words were technically correct. The tone was not hostile, but there was something in the way Cell described the colonists' daily lives, their work, their hours, their resource quotas, that made each sentence feel like a door being quietly locked. I stood to the side and watched the crowd. There was a man near the front named Gordon Hale. He was 53, heavy-shouldered, with hands that had spent 30 years working in high-pressure extraction environments. He had helped build the primary refinery on Marin's Deep with a crew of 20 people over 4 years, in conditions that should have been impossible. He was looking at Coordinator Cell with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a person who had decided, completely and without drama, that they were not going to comply. Not today, not ever, but they were going to wait for the right moment to say so. Behind Gordon stood a younger woman named Claire Novick. She was maybe 25, one of the second-generation colonists born on Marin's Deep, which meant she had never actually lived on Earth. This planet was not a posting to her. It was home. She was listening to Cell with her arms folded and her jaw set in a way that reminded me, with a force I was not expecting, of my own mother. Coordinator Cell finished speaking and asked if there were questions. Gordon Hale raised his hand. "You said the morning shift starts at what hour exactly?" he asked. Cell repeated the time. Gordon nodded slowly. "And who decided that?" "The Resource Efficiency Bureau," Cell said, "in accordance with Council Administrative Directive 47, subsection 9. "Right," Gordon said. "And where is the Resource Efficiency Bureau?" "It operates from the Council Administrative Hub at Kepler Station." "So the people who decided when my crew starts work," Gordon said very calmly, "have never been to Marin's Deep." Cell paused, not out of embarrassment. Vethkai did not experience embarrassment. The pause was a processing delay, the brief moment when a being that lived for 4,000 years determined that the question was not worth addressing at length. "The directive applies uniformly across all ward territories," Cell said. "Uniformly," Gordon repeated. "Correct." Gordon nodded once more, then stepped back into the crowd. The matter was, apparently, closed. Cell moved on to the next item on the administrative agenda. I watched Gordon move through the crowd until he was standing beside 2 other crew chiefs. He did not speak to them. He simply stood near them. But I saw the look that passed between them, brief, certain, the kind of look that carried entire conversations in half a second. I had grown up reading human faces. It was, if nothing else, something we were very good at. I knew what that look meant. That evening, I received the message from Earth. It came through on a personal channel, encrypted with a code that had been established years before the council vote, during planning sessions that had officially never taken place. The message was short. It was from someone I had served with 15 years ago, a woman named Frances Cole, who was now one of the senior coordinators on the Joint Defense Council. The message said, "We remember what we are. Authorization granted, your discretion." I sat with that for a long time in my small assigned quarters at the edge of the colonial administrative zone. Outside, the iron-colored sky had finally committed to rain. It came down steadily on the rooftops and the equipment yards and the long roads between the processing towers. I thought about the council chamber. I thought about Oru's assessment and his 4 categories and his ranking that placed us last. I thought about Coordinator Cell explaining shift schedules to people who had built this world themselves. I thought about what the Vethkai had studied when they assessed us. They had studied our biology. They had measured our lifespan and our emotional responses and our decision-making inconsistencies. They had run models and projections and simulations. They had not read a single history book. If they had, they would have found a pattern. A very clear, very consistent, very human pattern. It appeared every time in our past when an outside force tried to tell us what we were worth, what we were allowed, and what we would simply have to accept. The pattern never ended well for the outside force. Over the next 4 weeks, I watched Marin's deep change in ways that were invisible if you did not know what to look for. The change was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, deliberate kind of change that humans had always been best at, the kind that happened in kitchens and storage rooms and the ends of shift breaks when nobody official was listening. Tools began to disappear from the registered inventory systems. Not large tools, not the kind that would trigger an audit. Small things, a calibration equipment, signal boosters, secondary power cells, that had a dozen legitimate uses and one very specific illegitimate one. They went into places that were not on any council map of the colony. The patrol routes of the 2 Vethkai security units stationed on Marin's Deep were mapped. I did not do this mapping. I did not ask anyone to do it. But within 3 weeks I had received, through informal channels, a complete and accurate schedule of where every administrator and security officer was at every hour of every day. People started eating together more. Long meals in the common facilities, tables pushed together, conversations that went quiet when I walked past and resumed when I turned the corner. I did not take offense. I understood. I was still officially a council liaison. I wore the designation on my collar. It did not matter that everyone on the planet knew which side I was actually on. There was a moment, midway through the 4th week, that I think about more than any other moment from that period. I had gone out early in the morning to check a relay station at the eastern edge of the colony. The sky was clear for once, cold and sharp, with the kind of visibility you rarely got on Marin's Deep. I was walking back along the main road when I saw a child, maybe 9 years old, dark-haired, wearing a coat that was slightly too big, sitting at the edge of the water reclamation reservoir with a length of cord and a bent piece of metal wire. She was fishing, or trying to. The reservoir was not stocked with anything. It was a practical joke that the older kids on the colony apparently played on the newer arrivals, sending them out to fish in a tank full of recycled water. But the girl did not seem bothered by the absence of results. She was patient in the way that children on frontier colonies learn to be patient, not because it came naturally, but because patience was a survival skill out here. I was about to walk past when I heard boots on the gravel behind me. I turned. Coordinator Cell was making his morning inspection rounds. He stopped when he saw the child. He looked at the cord in her hands and at the reservoir and at the bent wire, and then he looked at me. This individual is engaged in unauthorized use of a council-administered water resource, he said. The girl looked up at him without fear. I noticed that about second-generation colonists. They had grown up in hard places. Strange things did not frighten them the way they might frighten someone who had spent their life in comfort. "I'm not using the water," she said. "I'm using the edge of the reservoir." The reservoir and its surrounding boundary are council-administered property, Cell said. Unauthorized activity within the boundary zone requires a permit. I stepped between them. "She's a child," I said. "The regulation does not distinguish by age," Cell said. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at me with the complete absence of reaction that was simply his natural state. "We're done here," I said. I took the girl's hand and walked her back toward the residential quarters. I did not look back at Cell. I heard him making a note in his administrative log as we walked away. That evening, something shifted in me that I had been keeping carefully in place for 6 months. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was more like a decision that had been forming in the background for a long time, waiting for a specific moment to become final. The council had looked at us and seen fragility. They had measured our lifespans and our emotions and our inconsistency and called it weakness. But the girl at the reservoir had sat patiently at the edge of a tank with a bent wire and no fish, completely unbothered, because she had been born on a world where nothing was given and everything was earned. That kind of endurance did not show up in their models. It never would. 2 nights later, the patrol schedule that had been quietly assembled over the previous weeks was used for the first time. A Vethkai security transport, fully manned, fully operational, was found at the eastern cargo dock with every single system completely inactive. The crew was unharmed. They had been moved, carefully and without incident, to a temperature-controlled storage facility where they remained comfortable until morning. The transport's power systems had been drained in a way that the Council's own engineers initially could not explain. Nobody claimed responsibility. Nobody needed to. The Vethkai filed an incident report. Coordinator Cell sent a formal inquiry to the colony administration. I responded with a 3-page document noting that the investigation was ongoing and that I would provide updates as information became available. That same morning, a signal left Marins Deep on a frequency that the Council monitoring systems were not designed to detect. It was brief, encoded, and pointed at a specific set of coordinates that were not on any Council star chart. I stood at the eastern dock looking at the sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the iron clouds, beyond the edge of Council map space, something was already moving. The first move had been made without a single weapon, without a single formal declaration, without a single raised voice. That was the thing about humans. We did not need any of those things to begin. The first sign that something had changed was a sound. It was not an explosion. It was not an alarm. It was a low, resonant pulse that passed through the hull of the EFS Thermopylae, the way a deep note passes through the floor of a concert hall felt before it was heard, settling in the chest rather than the ears. I felt it from my station on the command deck, and I knew immediately what it meant. We had dropped out of faster-than-light travel, along with every other ship in Operation Long Memory, at exactly the same moment. I was standing at the forward observation bay when the Thermopylae's windows cleared from the FTL transit haze, and I saw, for the first time, what 40 years of quiet planning actually looked like. 12 star systems all at once. The Thermopylae was positioned at the edge of the Marins Deep system, but I had the operations feed open on my command display, pulling real-time telemetry from all 12 simultaneous engagement zones. Every feed showed the same thing. Earth ships, human ships, vessels that had officially been decommissioned years ago and unofficially been sitting in unmapped dry docks waiting for exactly this moment, dropping out of FTL in coordinated formations with a precision that the Council's own tactical analysis had rated as mathematically impossible to achieve in secret. It was the word impossible that I kept coming back to. The Vethkai and their assessors had modeled human organizational capability. They had run their simulations. They had concluded that a species with our emotional profile, our lifespan limitations, our decision-making inconsistencies, could not maintain the secrecy and coordination necessary for an operation of this scale. They had forgotten one thing. Humans kept secrets the same way we did everything else. We worked at it harder than anyone else thought we were capable of. The opening phase of Operation Long Memory lasted 14 minutes. In those 14 minutes, human forces secured communications infrastructure in all 12 systems, established perimeter blockades around Council administrative installations, and broadcast a single message on all council-monitored frequencies. The message was 2 sentences long. It said that the Galactic Council's ward directive had been exercised without the consent of the people it affected, and that humanity was now exercising its own directive in response. It did not call it a war, it called it a correction. I was watching the Marin's deep feed when Coordinator Cell's administrative transport attempted to leave the colony's upper atmosphere. It got 400 kilometers before a human intercept vessel pulled alongside it, matched its speed exactly, and held position. The transport stopped. There was a brief communication exchange. The transport returned to the surface. No weapons had been fired in the Marin's deep system. That was not true everywhere. In the Caro system, the Vethkai had a significant military presence, 2 full patrol wings and a command station that had been established 6 months after the ward directive as a peacekeeping installation. When the human forces arrived, the patrol wings launched immediately. What followed was the first actual combat of Operation Long Memory, and I watched it on the tactical feed with a feeling I could not entirely name. It was not excitement. It was not satisfaction. It was something heavier than both. Our pilots were good. They had been training in secret for years, running simulations that were calibrated against Vethkai tactics down to the last variable. But the Vethkai were experienced in a way that simulations could not fully replicate. They had been fighting wars of one kind or another for 50,000 years. The first exchange was brutal and honest, and when it was over, both sides had lost ships. Then the Vethkai deployed the resonance fleet. I had read the intelligence reports about the resonance weapons. I had read them 3 times, actually, because the first 2 times I had not fully believed what I was reading. The resonance system worked by generating a specific frequency that interacted with human neural tissue. It did not damage the tissue. It activated it, all of it, simultaneously, producing a systemic pain response that was, according to the medical assessments, extraordinary in its intensity. The reports were accurate. When the resonance fields hit the human fleet at Caro, I heard it in the comms. Not screaming, our pilots did not scream because you could not fly while screaming, but something in the quality of every voice changed. The words were still clear. The commands were still correct. But underneath each transmission was a tightness, a compression, the sound of someone speaking through something that was trying very hard to stop them. The Vethkai Admiral, a being called High Commander Vron, opened a channel to the human fleet commander at Caro. His voice came through the system with the same flat certainty that all senior Vethkai carried. "Why do you continue?" he asked. "Your losses are significant, your crews are impaired. The tactical projections are not favorable. Withdrawal is the logical course." The human fleet commander at Caro was a man named Captain Owen Burke. I had served briefly with Owen Burke 12 years ago on a border patrol rotation. He was not a dramatic person. He did not give speeches. He had a habit of responding to difficult situations with the flattest possible statements of fact. Owen Burke's response to High Commander Vron was exactly 4 words. "We've read our history." The channel closed. What happened next at Caro was the moment that, I believe, genuinely confused the Vethkai more than anything else in the entire operation. The resonance fields were still active. The pain response in the human crews was real and ongoing and measurable. The tactical projections Vron had referenced were, by objective calculation, accurate. And the human fleet kept moving forward. Not recklessly, not in some emotional disregard for consequences, methodically, carefully, with full awareness of every calculation that argued against it. The crews worked through the pain the way humans had always worked through pain, by converting it into information, by using it. It was an engineer on one of the smaller support vessels, a 27-year-old named Petra Walsh, who first articulated what everyone was already figuring out in real time. She had noticed that the intensity of the resonance effect increased with proximity to the generating ships. She broadcast a single observation on the fleet channel, Between what I could hear were very controlled breaths. If it hurts more, we're closer. Use it as a range marker. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds on the fleet channel. Then Owen Burke said simply, "All units confirm you heard that." Every unit confirmed. What followed was something that no Vethkai tactical model had ever included as a variable, because no Vethkai tactical model had ever considered that a species might use its own pain as a navigation tool. The human fleet oriented itself by the intensity of its own suffering, moved through it rather than away from it, and closed the distance to the resonance generators, in a formation that the Vethkai response algorithms had not been programmed to counter. The resonance fleet was neutralized in 41 minutes. The method was not elegant. It was not the kind of strategy that would be written about in tactical textbooks as a masterpiece of military planning. It was improvised, uncomfortable, and almost painfully practical. It was, in other words, exactly what humans did when given a problem and no good options. We made a worse option work. By the time the Caro engagement concluded, 10 of the 12 systems were fully under human control. The remaining 2 were in the final stages of securing. The Council's administrative installations had been isolated without significant harm to their personnel. That had been a specific directive from Earth Command, and every unit had maintained it even when maintaining it complicated the operational picture. We were not here to hurt anyone more than necessary. We were here to take back what was ours. High Commander Vron attempted one more communication before the Caro system was fully secured. This time he directed the channel to me, specifically, which told me that the Council had been watching my role in this from the beginning. "Commander Reyes," he said, "you initiated this." "We initiated this together," I said. "You started it at the Council session. We're finishing it here. You should have pursued diplomatic resolution." "We tried that," I said. "You called us weak and took our colonies." There was a pause. With a Vethkai, a pause was significant. They did not pause out of uncertainty. They paused when they were recalculating. "We did not anticipate this response," Vron said. "It was the most honest thing I had heard from a Council representative in 6 months." "I know," I said. "You should have read our history books, not our biology reports." I closed the channel. 19 hours after the first ships had dropped out of FTL, all 12 systems were back under human jurisdiction. The Council's administrative personnel had been secured and treated without harm. The Ward Directive had been, in practical terms, erased. The cost of that erasure sat in the data files on my command display, and I could not look at those files for very long at one time. But the war, if it could be called a war, in those 19 hours was over. The correction had been made. The memorial was 4 wooden boards and a sheet of metal. I do not know who built it. It appeared overnight in the central square of the Marin's deep colony, maybe 2 days after the last of the Council administrators had been escorted to the transport that would return them to Kepler Station. Nobody took credit for building it. Nobody needed to. It was the kind of thing that happens in human communities after something large and terrible and necessary. Someone builds a thing in the dark, alone, and by morning it is simply there. The names were written by hand. That surprised me more than the memorial itself. In a colony full of digital systems and printing equipment, someone had written each name by hand, in careful, unhurried letters on the surface of the metal sheet. There were 61 names on it. I stood in front of it alone on a cold morning, 3 days after the operation ended, and I read all of them. I knew 4 of the names. The other 57 were strangers to me, which meant nothing except that I had been in a different part of the operation, focused on a different piece of the same problem, while they were somewhere else doing their part. That was how it worked. You knew your corner. You did not always know the whole shape of the thing. The name I kept returning to was near the middle of the list. It said, Lieutenant Daniel Akafer, 29 years old, Caro engagement. He had been a pilot. That was all I knew standing there in the square. I stayed there longer than I planned to. I had brought coffee, which had gone cold in my hand without my noticing. I drank it anyway, cold and slightly bitter, the way colonial coffee always was regardless of where you went. There was something grounding about the bitterness. It kept you present. Behind me I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate and not quite human in their rhythm. The Vethkai diplomat who stopped beside me had arrived on Marin's Deep the previous afternoon. His name was Assessor Kale, and he had not come with any administrative authority. He had come, according to his own communication, to observe and to understand. It was not a common request from a Vethkai, and the fact that it had been made told me something had shifted inside the council, at least fractionally. He stood beside me and looked at the memorial for a long time. He was nearly 2.5 meters tall, which meant I was looking at approximately his shoulder, which meant neither of us was looking at the other while we spoke. That was fine. Some conversations went better that way. "This is a practice of remembrance," he said. His translated voice was the standard flat tone, but something in the packing was different, slower. "Yes," I said. "The names are the individuals lost in the operation." "Yes." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "We do not do this." "I know," I said. "We record, we archive, we calculate the numerical loss and adjust our projections accordingly." He paused. "But we do not stand in the cold and read the names." "No," I said, "you don't." Another silence. The wind moved through the square. Somewhere behind us, in the direction of the residential quarters, a door opened and closed. The colony was waking up. "May I ask you something?" Kale said. "Yes." "What are you doing?" I looked at the list of names. Daniel Akaffer, 29 years old. Caro engagement. I thought about a person I had never met who had gotten into a ship and pointed it at a resonance generator using pain as a compass. "Remembering," I said. "To what end?" I thought about that for a moment. It was a genuine question, not a dismissive one. Kale had been standing in the cold with me long enough that I was reasonably confident he wanted an actual answer. "Because it matters that he existed," I said. Daniel Akaffer, 29 years old. He was someone before any of this. He had a morning routine and a way he liked his food and something that made him laugh. All of that is gone now. If I walk away from this list and don't remember that it's gone, then it's like none of it mattered. And that's not acceptable to me. Kale was quiet for so long that I glanced up at him. He was still looking at the memorial. His expression was, as always, unreadable by human standards. But his body was still in the way that I had come to understand, meant he was doing something internal that was significant for him. "You know you will die," he said. "Yes." "All of you, every human alive knows this." "Yes." "And yet you fight, you plan, you build and grieve and remember." He paused. "In our models, the awareness of death is a limiting factor. A species that knows it will die should rationally place less weight on individual actions because the individual is temporary." "We put more weight on it," I said. "Yes," he said, "that is what I cannot model." I turned to look up at him properly now. "Because in your models, brevity means less value, but for us it's the opposite. Everything we have is temporary, which means everything matters completely. You've lived so long that you've forgotten what anything is worth. We never had the luxury of forgetting." He looked at me then, from his considerable height, with those dark eyes that had seen 60,000 years of galactic history. "That is not a biological assessment," he said. "No," I said, "it's not." He looked back at the memorial. "I would like to know his name," he said. "Daniel Akaffer." "Yes," I said. "Lieutenant Daniel Akaffer, 29 years old." Kale repeated it once quietly in his own language first and then in translated standard. It sounded strange in his flat, careful voice, but he said it. He said it completely. Then he said, "I will include this in my report to the council." Include whatever you think is true, I said. I do not yet know what to call it, he said. Call it human, I said. He considered that. Then he said, I am not certain the council has the context to understand that as a meaningful category. They will, I said, give them time. He turned then and walked slowly back in the direction of the transport area. I watched him go, this ancient, enormous being, moving carefully through a colony that had been built by people who knew they would not live to see its final form, carrying in his internal archive the name of a young pilot who had used his own pain as a tool and would never fly again. I turned back to the memorial. There was a sound behind me, small footsteps. I did not turn around yet. A cup appeared in my peripheral vision, held out by a small hand at approximately waist height. I looked down. It was the dark-haired girl from the reservoir. She was holding out a cup of coffee with the careful, two-handed grip of a child who understood that the thing she was carrying was important. I took it. It was terrible, burnt and over-extracted and barely warm. It was exactly the kind of coffee that got made when someone did not have much to work with and tried anyway. I drank all of it. Thank you, I said. She looked at the memorial for a moment. Then she asked, with the directness that frontier children had, whether those were people who did not come back. Yes, I said. She thought about that. My dad says they won. They did, I said. She nodded seriously, the way children nod when they are filing something important into permanent memory. Then she went back inside, and I stood alone again in the square with an empty cup and 61 names. I stayed until the cold made my hands stiff. Then I went to find my ship. The corridor outside the council chamber was the same temperature it had always been. Cold, deliberate, designed. I had stood in this corridor before, on the other side of a session that had gone badly, listening to the distant sound of something that might have been laughter. I did not wait this time, I walked. My name is HFY. I was 42 years old now. I had been awake for most of the past year. I walked without hurrying because there was no longer any reason to hurry. Whatever was going to happen in that room had already been decided, not by vote, not by argument, but by 19 hours of coordinated action across 12 star systems and the 61 names on a sheet of metal in a colonial square on a planet under an iron sky. The council chamber doors opened as I approached. It was different this time, not dramatically different. The chamber was the same enormous curved space, the same cold lighting, the same rows of delegates from every species that called itself Galactic. But certain things had changed that a careful observer would notice. There were more empty seats in the Vethkai than I had ever seen before, not because their delegation had shrunk, because several delegates who had previously sat on the Vethkai side had, over the past 8 months, quietly shifted their positions, not physically, but in their formal council alignments. The Sul representatives had filed a joint brief 4 months ago calling for a review of the ward directive system entirely. The Doreth had submitted what amounted to a letter of disapproval regarding the original assessment methodology. 3 smaller species I knew primarily by their council designations had simply, without ceremony, gone on record as supporting human sovereignty. Nothing as dramatic as alliance, nothing as warm as friendship, just a gradual, careful recalibration by beings who had watched what happened and revised their conclusions accordingly. That was how the council worked, slowly, but it worked. I crossed the floor to the podium. No escort this time. I had been granted the floor by formal request, under a session agenda that listed me as primary presenting representative of the Independent Human Sovereignty Delegation, a title that did not exist 1 year ago and existed now because we had made it exist. Councillor Vreth opened the session and recognized me. I placed a single document on the central dais. It was not a petition. I wanted that to be understood from the first moment. It was not a request for consideration or a plea for membership or another carefully structured argument for why we deserve to be here. The document was Earth's terms, full, complete, and not negotiable on the central points. I had written it myself over 4 weeks, in the small quarters on Marin's Deep, sitting at a desk while the iron sky did or did not rain outside my window. I had read it to Frances Cole over an encrypted line, and she had read it to the Joint Defense Council, and they had returned it with 6 minor modifications and no major ones. That felt right. The document had 4 primary requirements: full human sovereignty over all human-settled worlds, inner and outer, with no war directive or equivalent mechanism applicable to any human territory going forward; permanent human representation on the Galactic Council with equal standing, equal access, and equal vote on all matters including those classified as internal council operations. A complete revision of the capability assessment process to include categories beyond biology and lifespan. Specifically, to include adaptive resilience, historical achievement relative to available time, and cross-generational knowledge retention. And finally, a mutual non-interference framework establishing that no council species would seek to administer, limit, or assess the capabilities of another species without formal consent. That last point was the one I had debated longest. It was also the one I was most certain about. I presented each point in order. I did not rush, and I did not elaborate beyond what was necessary. The chamber was quiet in the way that these chambers were always quiet, not empty quiet, but the quiet of thousands of beings who were capable of sitting completely still for very long periods of time. I had learned not to interpret that silence as hostility. It was simply their version of listening. When I finished, I stepped back from the podium. Councillor Vreth asked if any delegate wished to raise questions before the council moved to deliberation. High Speaker Ven, the Vethkai's primary political representative, a being who I understood had been in continuous council service for over 900 years, rose from the upper tier. He moved to the floor. He was the oldest-looking being I had ever seen in person, which was saying something given the company I had been keeping. There was something in the particular quality of his stillness that communicated age in a way that transcended appearance. He had been in this room, or rooms like it, for longer than my civilization had been writing things down. He stood opposite me on the floor, and he looked at me with the dark, patient eyes of something that had outlasted entire species. "Commander Reyes," he said, "your operation was successful. The tactical achievement was beyond our projected parameters. This has been formally acknowledged in the council record." "Thank you," I said. "What I find myself unable to fully process," he said, "is the decision that followed the operational success." I waited. "You had forward momentum," he said. "You had 12 systems, active forces, and a council that was significantly less certain of its position than it was at any point in the previous 4 decades. The strategic logic of that moment would, by any standard model, suggest continued expansion of advantage. Press the position, extract maximum concessions, establish dominance while the window exists." He paused. "Instead, you stopped. You secured what you had taken. You offered terms rather than demands. You treated the personnel of council installations with care even when doing so complicated your operational timelines." He looked at the document on the central dais. "And the terms you have placed before us today are firm but not punitive. You are not asking us to diminish ourselves. You are asking us to acknowledge you." "Yes," I said. "Why?" he asked. It was a genuine question. I had been asked variations of this question by Assessor Kale on Marin's Deep, and by Frances Cole on the encrypted line, and by myself, alone, in the middle of the night when the quieter parts of my mind went to places I did not always invite them. But this was the first time the question had been asked in this chamber, in front of every species in the council, by someone who had the full authority to act on the answer. I thought about how to say it, Not because I did not know, because this was the version that mattered. Because what we did, I said, was take back what belonged to us. That was legitimate. That was necessary. If we had kept going beyond that, if we had used the momentum to diminish you, to establish our own version of the Ward Directive over anyone else, then we would have proven your original assessment correct. Venn tilted his head slightly. Explain. Your assessment said we were compromised by our emotions, that we were unpredictable, that we could not be trusted with full standing because our decision-making was inconsistent. I looked at him steadily. If we had acted on pure momentum and turned a correction into a conquest, we would have shown you exactly that. We would have been acting on anger and opportunity rather than principle. We would have been exactly what you said we were. The chamber was very quiet. The terms in that document, I said, are not generous. We are not giving anything away. What we want we have put in writing and we intend to have, but they are fair. They do not ask for your humiliation. They ask for your respect, which is different. I paused. Because then we would have just been you, and we decided a long time ago that we did not want to be you. High Speaker Venn was still for a long time. Then he said, that is a significant statement. I know, I said. It implies a moral framework. It does. One that you were willing to hold to even when the practical advantage ran in the other direction. Yes. He looked at me for another long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the Vethkaitier. The deliberation took 4 hours. I waited in the anteroom outside the chamber, in a chair that was the right size for me, with a cup of coffee that was surprisingly good. Someone on the administrative staff had evidently been paying attention to human preferences. I appreciated that in a way I could not fully articulate. Frances Cole called on the encrypted channel twice during the wait. The first time she asked how it had gone. I said I thought it had gone well. The second time she did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, "Your mother would have been proud of you." I did not respond to that, but I held the phone for a while after the call ended. The deliberation bell rang. I walked back into the chamber. The vote was held in the formal council manner, each delegation's representative activating their designation beacon in sequence, the results compiled in real time on the chamber display. It took 11 minutes for all delegations to register. The final count was displayed. Humanity received full council membership. Not by a narrow margin, not as a charity, not as the smallest possible concession from a body that had been forced into a corner. The count was clear and final and entered into the permanent council record with the same clean finality that all council decisions carried. I stood on the floor and looked at the number on the display. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had expected something large, some wave of triumph or vindication or relief. What I actually felt was quieter than that, steadier, like something that had been leaning against a wall for a long time had finally been allowed to stand on its own. Councillor Vreth announced the result and declared the formal establishment of the human seat on the Galactic Council. He used the standard language. He used it completely and correctly, without modification or qualification. That mattered. Then he said, "Commander Reyes, will you take the seat?" I looked up at the human tier. It had been added during the 4 months of pre-session negotiations, a quiet structural modification to the chamber that nobody had made a public statement about. It was positioned at the same level as the other primary species delegations, not the floor, not the upper tier, the middle ring where the equals sat. The chair was there. I walked up the access ramp to the human tier. It was a short walk, but I took it at a normal pace, because I had learned a long time ago that the moments that mattered were not the ones you rushed through. I reached the seat. It was slightly too big for me. Not dramatically, just enough that when I sat down, there was a small but perceptible gap between my back and the backrest, and my feet settled on the floor with a flatness rather than a comfortable angle. Whoever had built it for a human in the general sense, without accounting for the specific human who would be sitting in it first. I sat in it anyway. I thought about Daniel Akaffer. I thought about Gordon Hale standing in the mud with his crew chiefs. I thought about Claire Novick with her arms folded and her jaw set. I thought about a dark-haired girl with a bent wire at the edge of a reservoir, patient and unbothered, waiting for something that was not there yet but might be if she stayed long enough. I thought about every person who had built something in the dark and the cold and the far distance, not because anyone told them to, not because the calculations favored it, but because it was what we did. We went further. We built further. We stayed longer than we were supposed to be able to. The chamber was settling back into its regular order around me. Delegates were returning to their conversations. The administrative machinery of the council was resuming its ordinary operations. 11,000 years of galactic political structure was simply continuing, as it always had, incorporating this new development the way it incorporated all developments, slowly, thoroughly, permanently. From the Vethkai tier, Assessor Kale caught my eye. He was not someone who gestured, but he inclined his head very slightly in my direction. I returned it. From somewhere in the middle rows, a Doreth delegate activated a small light on their console, a gesture that their species made in formal settings to indicate acknowledgement. I was not sure I was the intended recipient. I was going to assume I was. I settled into my seat. The backrest was still slightly too far away. The angle was still slightly off. I was going to be sitting in this chair for a long time, and I was going to need to learn every imperfect centimeter of it. That was fine. It always felt like that at first, like the chair was too big, the room too cold, the odds too long, the distance too far, the timeline too short. Like the numbers did not add up, and the voices in the room did not know your name, and the space you were trying to occupy had not quite decided to hold you yet. We sat down anyway. We had always sat down anyway. We always would.